Hello, I'm Bonnie Erbe. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. 30 years ago, Anita Hill testified at a Senate hearing on Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. It was a bold move. Hill told the all-white male panel that Thomas sexually harassed her when she worked for him at the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Thomas was still confirmed to a seat on the High Court. However, Hill's bold testimony served as the catalyst for other women to come forward and speak about sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. It also set Anita Hill on a 30-year journey to end gender violence. Today, Hill is a professor of social policy and women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis University. She joins me today to talk about her new book, Believe It. Welcome, Anita Hill. We are so thrilled to have you.
It's a pleasure to be on your program.
First, tell the audience, please, why the title Believing?
Well, it really came from listening to victims and survivors, hearing from them by email, letter, and really believing that we needed to do better from all standpoints of the kind of behavior that they were experiencing, whether it was bullying or sexual assault or harassment or rape or intimate partner violence.
And have we gotten there yet?
In the 30 years, we certainly haven't gotten where we need to be. I think we've made some progress. I think we've learned to identify the behaviors. We've acknowledged that they exist to a certain extent. We don't know the full extent yet. We've tapped into and maybe adjusted a bit some of our cultural responses to the problem. I think there's less victim blaming going on, but that's not entirely over. We still dismiss the harm that this problem causes individuals and communities and our society at large. We haven't gotten there with our structures, though. We still have policies and processes in place that really have failed us and will continue to fail us until we change them.
I remember covering that hearing. I was working for a radio network as Supreme Court correspondent at the time. And I remember thinking of you as a really brave, really scared individual. And of course, appropriately so, given that hearing shattered the universe. And there you were confronting a man who everybody pretty much knew was going to get through regardless. How did you feel?
Well, first of all, I've been called brave or courageous, and I want people to understand that being courageous doesn't mean being fearless. I mean, when you're courageous, you take on your fears, and that's exactly what I tried to do, to take on my fears, because I thought, and I think to even to today, that the consequences of not testifying were bigger than any fears that I had about testifying. And so I was able to overcome those because I realized that an appointment to the highest court in our land for a lifetime tenure was bigger than one individual's fears. And that if we didn't confront, if I didn't testify to what I knew about his behavior, that the committee would not have complete information to evaluate the character and fitness of Clarence Thomas for the position on the court.
And yet he was confirmed regardless by a committee chaired by then Senator Joe Biden. What does that make you? You know, you have an inside track on at least the 30 years ago, the thoughts of now President Biden. Do you feel you were treated fairly?
I think the whole process was really flawed. mean, there are some specific instances where the Republican senators were allowed to ask whatever they wanted to ask of me, but they were limited in terms of what they could ask of Clarence Thomas. There were problems, I believe, with the investigation. The investigation was controlled by a body, the FBI, that was really under the control of the president. And we learned that again in 2018 when President Trump limited the investigation into Judge Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearing. But the thing that I think that bothers me the most about the way the process was handling was that there were 3 corroborating witnesses and even a 4th who had their own experiences of harassing behavior and inappropriate behavior that Thomas had done with them, and they were not called. They were not called to testify publicly. Instead, their testimony was put in the record in written form, and we haven't actually, in a public way, heard from them since then. I'm not sure that they want to bother to testify, but I think it was just a travesty not to call those witnesses because these were women I didn't know. They weren't saying that what had happened to me. They weren't talking about that. They were talking about their own experiences of having been harassed by Clarence Thomas.
And sure, numbers certainly helps a lot in terms of believability, correct?
Unfortunately, we still, because so often women are coming up against very powerful men, it still takes multiple witnesses, multiple victims to come forward in order to convince a body or even the public that someone has engaged in violence or other misconduct. And so it does matter. Those numbers especially did matter in 1991 when the topic in terms of a public conversation was very, very new. And people needed to have all of the information, including information from expert witnesses on the topic of sexual harassment who were not called.
When you did decide to come forward 30 years ago, did you ever in your mind think that you would become the feminist icon you have become?
No, I didn't. There were mixed feelings at the time, 30 years ago, about my testimony, whether I should or shouldn't come forward, whether I had actually helped or hurt the cause of gender equity. So I didn't expect that, but my evolution to this point has come after years and years of hearing from victims and survivors who want a voice, who want solutions, who want what has happened to them, whether, again, whatever the behavior, they want it to stop and they don't want it to happen to other people. And unfortunately, they have not been heard enough from, they have not been made part of the solution in ways that will help end the problem. And so I'm here not to speak for them, but to give them space to speak and to challenge our leadership to make sure that they are willing to step up and make change.
Now you have devoted, you're a professor, as we talked about, of gender studies, women's rights, etc., gender violence. How do you put what happened to you, what Clarence Thomas did to you, which included talking about pubic hair on a Coke bottle, referencing his private male parts, and pornography, which that part has many people have come out and confirmed. What do you think about lumping that behavior in with rape, sexual assault, what, for example, Christine Blasey Ford suffered at the hands of then Judge Kavanaugh? How does just saying things to you, confronting you, affronting you, possibly giving the woman at the other end of these conversations a, PTSD kind of experience, but not touching you. How do you lump that in with actual hands-on sexual violence?
Well, sexual harassment, as defined by the law, does not need to include touching. As a matter of fact, it's been clear for years that creating a hostile environment, psychologically a hostile environment, is enough to create a cause of action. So that's one thing. That was one of the, I think, misunderstandings that people had in 1991, that there had to be some kind of physical touching in order to be sexual misconduct of any kind. But secondly, throughout the world, different countries and even the United Nations has been looking at what constitutes gender violence. And they include in that not only physical violence, but economic violence and psychological and emotional violence. And when that happens in the workplace, when someone is constantly discussing pornography or their own sexual interests or fetishes, and coupling that with, pressing for dates in a sexual or a romantic relationship, is enough to constitute sexual harassment.
What were you thinking as you followed the Christine Blasey Ford testimony in the Senate about having essentially been sexually assaulted, raped by a younger, drunk college student, Brett Kavanaugh?
I absolutely thought that the deck was stacked against her from the beginning. She had no place that she knew of how to report the behavior during the time that leading up to the confirmation hearing. She had, and she was blamed, in fact, for going to Senator Feinstein about that. That was used against her, even though the Senate had no process. And I keep coming back to the process. And it's important, not just because of how it failed me, or not just because of how it failed Christine Blasey Ford, but because it's a reflection on our government's ability to address this problem in a fair way. When you have complaints come forward, there's still no process, as far as I know, in the Senate Judiciary Committee for people to come forward in. But even more so, it's also a reflection of some of the many flawed processes that individuals throughout the country have to deal with. So,
let's talk about that process. What should it be? And what should it be for a woman who isn't going before the Senate Judiciary Committee on a Supreme Court nominee, but for example, a $2.14 an hour woman who waits tables in a bar in Louisiana? What should be the process for everyone from that woman up to your situation?
Well, in the beginning, there should be a process, and we don't. You would be surprised at the number of people who are not covered by any processes at all. Maybe because they're not covered by the Civil Rights Act, because the number of employees are less than what the Act covers. They could be gig workers. They could be individuals who are contractors, who are not employees at all. So there are places where there are no processes at all. But in the event that there is a process, one of the things that needs to happen is that the process has to be clear. It has to be made evident to the individuals who are working in a workforce, and there needs to be some transparency and accessibility. One of the complaints that I get, and I've done research on this at the Hollywood Commission, is that the processes are so remote, and one never knows when you enter the process exactly what's going to happen next. You don't know who's going to investigate your claim, whether there will be an investigation. You don't know anything about how the process is going to proceed. And you're left with doubt because, and this is also something I've found, mostly people believe that if you're complaining against a powerful individual, there will be no accountability. That $2.14 an hour restaurant worker will be seen as expendable, whereas if you're complaining about the top chef, that person isn't expendable. So it's a combination of clarity and fairness and accessibility, but it's also a question of accountability when you find that there has been wrongdoing.
Tell me how you think that process should work. Should there be a central location? There's already the EEOC, as we know. What should the path of accountability be? What should the process?
The path of accountability should not even start with the EEOC. And that's why I say it has to be clear. It has to be available. There have to be people educated about the process by the employer. So that's the first path. And there has to be some assurance based on behavior that there will be accountability if you access that process. And that includes things like making sure that there is a full investigation, that you're not limiting, that the investigation includes context and of the behavior, that it's well stated, made public. It's not sort of behind some screen that people can't access, especially if you're not sitting in front of a computer all the time in your job, because there are people who aren't sitting at a desk so that they can look up the policy or practice on their computer. So there are all kinds of ways, and to say to say exactly what a process should be is going to depend on the circumstances of the work that people are in. So
what's the appeal? What's the appeal if you go to your employer and you're blown off in some, they go through some sham process and it goes nowhere? Do you then go to the police? Do you go to the FBI? What's the next step?
Well, the next step, if you're talking about workplace harassment, it can vary. If there's a sexual assault involved, you can go to the police. You can go to the police from the beginning if there's a sexual assault involved. If you're talking about a sexual harassment complaint, of course, you can go to your state agency, your human rights agency, and they usually are in partnership with the EEOC, or you can go directly to the EEOC if that doesn't exist. And once again, what we have to have in that process is really an agency that rigorously enforces and prioritizes the behavior that's being claimed up as a civil rights violation.
But aren't you talking about, so these localities across the country, that whether it's an issue of county law or state law, that's still an awful lot of laws that would need to be passed to get this process available in every location in the US, correct?
Well, the way the EEOC works and the way the EEOC works for certain employment arrangements, if the number of employees is high enough, the EEOC would function as the agency to go to. There may be supplemental laws in states, but the EEOC is the go-to organization for the majority of the workers who are employees in this country. So if there are other workers, other type of workers, contractors, for example, or the gig workers, then there are laws that might cover them, that might be state laws, there might be cities, local laws that might cover their situations. What I'm trying to say is that the problem is big enough that we shouldn't be concerned saying, oh, well, there'll be too many laws to cover this. The problem is big enough that we should make sure that the problem doesn't exist, whatever it takes. And that should probably ultimately involve some coordination between state and local entities and the federal government. But we're not there yet. We haven't put the system together. We're not just talking about individual local policies. We're talking about systems that need to be in place to address just the problem of harassment in the workplace. And you haven't even gotten into the problem of sexual assault and the low rate of convictions, but not only low rate of convictions, but even when a sexual assault or rape is reported to the policeman, there is a low rate of investigations. There's a low rate of referral of complaints to a district attorney. Then there's an even lower rate of the district attorney accepting the case and putting a case before a jury. There are sometimes judges that intervene even after a jury decision has been raised, as has happened recently in the Bill Cosby case. So we're talking about a complex system, and it's not going to be easy. The problem is complex, but we have to start. We have to understand that the urgency is to stop this behavior, because it's not only harming individuals who are direct victims, it's harming families, it's harming communities, it's harming really our entire nation, but specifically our institutions where this behavior is happening.
Do you think, but for Anita Hill, the Me Too movement would not have started?
I think the hearings in 1991 and my testimony was one catalyst. I think there was a momentum that began to build in 1991 from feminists, from organizers who put together advocacy efforts, from students who in colleges and universities had been hoping for safer environments there. I think it came about because of researchers like a woman named Louise Fitzgerald, who studied the topic well before anybody was talking about it in the public sphere. And it built. It was something that built up over the years, and social media allowed it to erupt in a way that I don't think anyone was expecting. But we've got to take all of that energy and come together with solutions. And what those solutions are not clear, is not clear what they all are. But one of the things that has to happen is that survivors and victims have to be part of making them. And our leadership has to follow.
And lastly, do you think the Me Too movement, as large as it was, as much publicity as it's gotten, do you think it's had lasting effect, even just in Hollywood? I've been told the casting couch mentality has not gone away.
Oh, it has not gone away completely. That's a cultural aspect that we are working to attempt to reverse. And there are many people who are coming into the Hollywood community who are resisting that. But history is hard to undo. And that part of the culture is not going to go away overnight or in the span of 3 or 4 years since the Me Too movement. But that's not to excuse any of us from acting now and doing whatever we can in our power to make sure that it does become history, a dead history, not an ongoing legacy.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Anita Hill. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about your new book, Believing. Best of luck to you with that. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please, let's continue the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our website, www.pbs.org. And if you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.